Knowing that I have only a few moments and that timekeeping is going to be draconian, I'm going to start while the PowerPoint is being resuscitated. I have no idea why I've landed in this slot on the program, except perhaps by dint of having thrown an absolutely unclassifiable title at the organizers. It would be the height of presumption for me, not a historian of art, a historian of science, in this glittering gathering of Warburgians to try and tell you something new about Warburg. Instead, I'm going to avail myself of David's gracious invitation to self-conscious reflection about the relationships between the humanities and the sciences. I'm going to more specifically try to articulate something about how humanists know what they know. I just mentioned that I'm a historian of science, and like most historians of science, I'm often called upon to mediate between the natural and the human sciences when mutual incomprehension, or sometimes mutual indignation, threatens to sever lines of communication altogether. We are the marriage counselors of the Republic of Letters, where the divorce rate is higher than that of the population at large. From this vantage point, I've noticed that when practitioners of the human sciences, which I'm using as a shorthand for both the humanities and the social sciences, when practitioners of the human sciences and natural sciences argue, both amongst themselves internally but also externally across these great divisions of knowledge, they deploy different strategies and standards of proof, evidence, probability, and plausibility. This is hardly surprising. What makes a discipline is that over time it's evolved exactly those distinctive strategies and standards of arguments which are tailored to the subject matter, and they're tested and taught over generations. But I have noticed something that did surprise me. The natural scientists were on the whole considerably more reflective and articulate about their strategies and standards of argument than their colleagues in the human sciences. Both groups commanded formidable bodies of knowledge, impressively arrayed and displayed. Both could demonstrate, often with great zest and brilliance, what they knew. But to put the matter very simply, the natural scientists were also able to explain how they knew what they knew, whereas their otherwise exquisitely articulate colleagues in the human sciences usually could not. In the language of the philosophy of science, the natural scientists have a rich epistemological vocabulary in which to reflect critically upon their various ways of knowing, the relative strengths and weaknesses of these ways of knowing. Think, for example, about the distinctions, very important distinctions, among concepts like validity, robustness, and sensitivity in the statistical tools used by the biomedical sciences. In contrast, it would not be too much of an exaggeration to say that there is no epistemology of the human sciences. And we historians and philosophers of science are mostly to blame for this. We've lavished a great deal of attention on how the natural sciences gradually developed and painstakingly refined ways of knowing, like the controlled experiment, systematic observation, mathematical models, error analysis, and more recently, computer simulation. But we historians of science have expended hardly a fraction of that inquisitive energy on the comparable ways of knowing in the human sciences, to the point where the very idea of an epistemology of the human sciences sounds strange or even presumptuous, a usurpation of the rights and privileges of the mightier natural sciences. No wonder, then, that there is such a glaring asymmetry in the levels of articulate reflection on such matters in the natural and human sciences. And no wonder that quite a few natural scientists, and perhaps even in the dark night of the soul, some humanists, entertain the suspicion that what the human sciences create isn't knowledge at all. I'd like to, in the very few minutes allotted to me, try to redress this balance in at least a small way by examining a way of knowing widely practiced across the humanities, the argument by exemplum. This form of argument is by no means unique to the human sciences, and in my conclusion, I'll give you some examples of exempla from the natural sciences. But it was in the human sciences that the argument by exemplum originated, and I would argue is still practiced with the greatest virtuosity. The exemplum is a genus that contains many species. The case study, the illustration, the ideal type, the model, the paradigm, and of course, the ubiquitous and indispensable specific example. These are all techniques of rendering the universal in the particular, the general in the specific, the abstract in the concrete, the macrocosm in the microcosm. Here I'm going to concentrate, however, on the exemplum and the oldest sense of that term as a kind of ennobled example, a pattern or a model to be imitated, a parable that warns or teaches, a legal precedent that can be enlisted in future judgments. In short, any concrete, specific instance that points far beyond itself. Exempla are turbo examples, radiating implications in all directions. They're singled out as sterling examples in English, Paradebeispiele in German, Exemple parfait in French, and Francis Bacon called them instantius ostentivus, instances which exhibit the nature in question in its, a wonderful Baconian phrase, in its exaltation. Such exempla are more than representative in the statistical sense of a representative sample drawn from a larger population. They are the distilled essence of a class of phenomena whose properties, boundaries, implications, and very existence is made visible and significant by the exemplum itself. But it's high time for me to stop talking about exempla and give you some. I'm going to give you 4 examples of exempla. They're called more or less randomly across the humanities. There's one from sociology, there's one from art history, there's one from literary history, and a 4th from the comparative study of mythology. All they have in common is that they display the power of exempla in the hands of a master of the genre. The power lies partly in the apposite example, partly in the adroit juxtaposition with other examples, and mostly in the ways in which the exemplum is glossed to yield generalizations, insight, and meanings that beam out from the exemplum like light from a beacon. So my first example, thank you. Great. My first example of an exemplum comes from the sociologist Erving Goffman's The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, which was first published in 1959 and has never been out of print since. He originally conceived this as a report on social stratification, especially in the physical confines of the home or the workplace. And his sharp eye for the telling vignette turned the most banal episodes into dramatic performances that revealed the script of social life, its roles, its plots, its stages and back pages. And he draws his exempla from an extremely broad range of possibilities. Some are from his own field work with Shetland Island crofters, others are from the social scientific literature, and the one I'm going to share with you today is actually simply what he calls informal memoirs written by a colorful person. So here is a quotation from such a colorful person. This is Sir Frederick Ponsonby, an officer of the British royal household who served as equerry, by this time no longer master of the horses, but personal advisor to Queen Victoria and later Edward VII. And he's offering advice, Sir Frederick is offering advice to King Haakon VII, who lived from 1872 to 1957, of Norway. Here you see him with his Queen Maud and their child. And the king is a little worried about his credentials with the people, and he's considering taking the tram rather than the royal motor car in order to show himself more democratic. And here's what Sir Frederick says to the king. I told him frankly that this would be a great mistake, as familiarity bred contempt. As a naval officer, he would know that the captain of a ship never had his meals with the other officers but remained quite aloof. I told him that he must get up on a pedestal and stay there. He could then step off occasionally, no harm would be done. The people did not want a king with whom they could hobnob. They wanted something nebulous, like the Delphic oracle. So what Sir Frederick thought was appropriate was more a picture like this one, King Haakon and Queen Maud in their regalia. Now, Goffman's point in citing this example is certainly not to endorse Ponsonby's theory of monarchy as mystification, but to show the workings of social distance at its most naked, as Bacon says of manifest instances. To perform as a king or to perform as a waiter in a Parisian cafe, which is another one of Goffman's examples, is to create what Goffman calls awe and distance between audience and performer, no matter in which gradient, in which direction the gradient of social status slants. So it slants upward to the king and downwards toward the garçon de café. Here is a Parisian cafe waiter as observed by none other than Jean-Paul Sartre. His movement is quick and forward, a little too precise, a little too rapid. He comes toward the patrons with a step a little too quick. He bends forward a little too eagerly. His voice, his eyes express an interest a little too solicitous for the order of the customer. He's playing, he's amusing himself, but what is he playing? We need not watch long before we can explain it. He's playing at being a waiter in a Paris cafe. Goffman comments on these examples, and you don't have to read the entire quotation. I just want to draw your attention to the very first line. I would like finally to add that the matters which the audience leave alone because of their awe of the performer, whether that performer is the King of Norway or a Parisian garçon de café, are likely to be the matters about which he would feel shame were a disclosure to occur. So let's pause for a moment to see how Goffman has milked his exemplum for all it's worth, and then some. Sir Frederick's advice to the king is not just the trivial revelation that court ceremony reinforces social distance, nor the almost as trivial generalization that we are all, like the king, like the cafe waiter, performing our assigned social roles. It's rather the insight into the complicity of audience and performers needed to imbue such performances with the dignity of the social stage, the assurance that all will unfold according to plan without disagreeable surprises. This complicity between the audience and the performer requires both deception and self-perception. And that is why, Goffman remarks, awe and shame are two sides of the same coin. If the performance flops, the audience is not just disappointed, they share in the shame of the flop. He doesn't allude to it, but Goffman's exploitation of this exemplum is a radical retelling of Hans Christian Andersen's modern fairy tale, The Emperor's New Clothes, which was published in 1837. After you read Goffman, the moral of this story is no longer fraud and pretense unmasked, but rather that all society is held together by collectively willed fictions. In a Goffman-esque reading, the child in the fairy tale who cries out that the emperor is naked is like the boor in the theater who gets up in the middle of the play and shouts that Hamlet is just an actor, what we all know and precisely do not want to know at that particular moment. My second example of an exemplum, expertly deployed, comes from the art historian Michael Baxandall's Painting and Experience in 15th Century Italy, published in its first edition in 1972, second edition, revised edition in 1988. in which Baxandall argues that 15th century Italian painting was in part designed to gratify the exercise of certain skills of visual interpretation cultivated by daily experience in, for example, discerning subtle palettes of reds and browns or estimating the volume of barrels in boxes. And here is Baxandall, a famous passage from Baxandall, on a detail of Paolo Uccello's Battle of San Romano. This is the battle fought between the Florentine and Sienese in 1435. The painting sequence of 3 panels was constructed between 1438 and 1440. And Baxandall is commenting on the extravagant red and gold brocade hat worn in the painting by the Florentine commander Niccolo da Tolentino, which is a cross between a balloon and a chef's toque. And this particular panel is now here in London at the National Gallery. Here's Baxandall. There are several ways of seeing Niccolo da Tolentino's hat in Uccello's Battle of San Romano. One is as a round hat with a flouncy crown. Another is as a compound of a ring and a plump, squared-off disc disguised as a hat. These are not mutually exclusive. Lorenzo de' Medici, who had this picture in his bedroom, would have seen both and accepted it as a sort of serial geometrical joke. It demands attention initially by its exaggerated size and splendor, then in the second stage by the paradox of the pattern, let's take a closer look at it, on this most three-dimensional of hats behaving as it were two-dimensional, spreading itself flatly on the picture plane. Then in the third stage, by a dawning anxiety about the polygon of the crown. But to construe the crown at all demands not only certain habits of inference, such as a presumption that the bit you cannot see is a regular continuation of the part you can. Not only this, but a factor of energy and interest in wells. That is, we will not bother to get this far unless we enjoy the exercise in some way, even if only on the level of exercising skills we value highly. Uccello's pictorial style must meet the proper cognitive style for the picture to work. Now, note how deftly Baxandall in this passage shepherds our attention to an apparently minor detail in this tumultuous battle scene. Remember, the rest of the battle scene. This is over 3 meters wide, by the way. So the horses are rearing, the banners are flying, spears are lancing, warriors are slaughtering one another. Why should our gaze rivet itself on this rather ridiculous hat? More precisely, why do we focus on this gaudy headpiece, which is so jarringly out of place on a battlefield where everyone else is attired in full armor? Baxandall has already succeeded in making his readers conscious of how the hat has magnetized their attention, and then he marches us through a quick set of visual hypotheses to construe those red and gold daubs on the canvas. It's a marker of the cognitive practices specific to 15th century Italy that Uccello and also Lorenzo de' Medici share, and a delight in exercising the solving of such visual riddles as that inscrutable bubble of a hat. All of this depends on a certain speed. This entire passage is only 8 sentences. All exempla are short. The word derives from the Latin verb eximo, to take out or excerpt a part of the larger whole. And it's part of the aesthetic of the exemplum that the explication should imitate its compact density. And what Baxandall is doing here is to articulate the visual hypotheses that make sense of the hat just enough to make his readers conscious that the eye and the mind must go through such steps in order to make sense of those blobs of paint. But if he were to belabor them too long, as no doubt he certainly could have, the process of reading will lose the sense of swift spontaneity so characteristic of ordinary seeing. Exempla, however, need not retrace the arc of perception in order to exhibit analytical power. My third example is incisively analytical, but it's almost austerely undescriptive. It's taken from a book called The Vehement Passions by the literary scholar Philip Fisher, published in 2002. And Fisher turns here to a famous passage from Augustine's Confessions, looking for an exemplum of the nature of all of the human passions. When Augustine asks himself in his Confessions what were the first sins that he committed as a baby, he points out that if we call a baby innocent, this is only because it lacks the strength and not because it lacks the will to do harm. He remembers seeing passionate jealousy in a baby who grew pale with envy whenever it saw its foster brother at their mother's breast. The infant's jealousy unfolds in a spectacle of anger, and in doing so reveals the core of anger or vehemence that is a constant oxygen within the combustion of the passions. So far, Fisher. So in a few sentences, he's traversed the distance between Augustine's choleric but impotent baby, but to the choleric, but in this case, anomalously impotent kings of tragedy. So Oedipus, Lear, Leontes, who must endure some insult or injury to their wills, and they react, as in this particular staging, with raging tantrums. Fisher's analysis of his exemplum expands to enfold all of the passions, not just anger. The passions mark the point of injury to the will by the unexpected, the unwanted, and the threatening. By signaling that an insult or injury to the will has taken place, the passions mark out for us a point where we expected the will to be able to succeed. So what Fisher calls the vehement passions ignite when the will is unexpectedly thwarted, which is why we feel anger even when the source that blocks the will is an unforeseen accident rather than a person with malicious intent. And it's also we, unlike that baby, do not feel anger when we are unable to fly like a bird or turn back the tide. Experience has taught us that the radius of our will does not extend that far. Fisher's insight, drawn from this exemplum from Augustine, is that the passions guard the blurred boundary between justified and unjustified expectations that the world will go according to our plans. My fourth and last exemplum comes from Wendy Doniger's Other People's Myths, published in 1988, also still in print, a work that addresses not only parallels in several great mythological traditions, but also the preconditions for making such comparisons. She relates the following Taoist parable of two ancient sages. Zhang Tzu and Hui Tzu had strolled onto the bridge over the Hao when the former observed, "See how the minnows are darting about. That is the pleasure of the fishes." "You not being a fish yourself," said Hui Tzu, "how can you possibly know in what consists the pleasure of fishes?" "And you not being I," retorted Zhuang Tzu, "how can you know that I do not know?" "And if I, not being you, cannot know what you know," urged Hui Tzu, "it follows that you, not being a fish, cannot know in what consists the pleasure of the fishes." "Let us go back," said Zhuang Tzu, "to your original question. You asked me how I knew in what consists the pleasure of the fishes. Your very question shows that you knew I knew. I knew it from my feelings on the bridge." Doniger uses her parable to make a series of arguments justifying the comparative study of mythology. First, she points out that the final rejoinder in the sages' debate, "I knew it from my feelings on the bridge," suggests both the perspectival nature of all knowledge on the bridge, but also the inexplicable bridge of emotion, my feelings, that connects us with the fishes. Plunging deeper into the waters below the bridge, she counters arguments that only insiders can understand their own traditions, an objection increasingly, and alas, increasingly violently, made to scholars of religion, by pointing out that to study marine biology, one does not need to become a fish. Indeed, one had better not be a fish. Finally, diving deeper still, She probes the blurred boundary between feeling and knowing. One need not be a fish to understand them. One need not even like fish, but it helps to like them. Analogously, the comparatist must be so amphibian to walk the razor's edge between detachment and sympathy. So I end with Doniger's exemplum because in her hands, it is not only explicitly epistemological, how can we know that others know, but a mise en abîme of epistemology and ethics. Who and where must we be to know what others know? Her spiraling reflection returns me to my point of departure, the power of Exempla and the epistemology of the humanities. In these 4 examples, we have caught a glimpse, and Exempla are always sidelong glances. They are never head-on stares. We've caught a glimpse of how Exempla can generalize, explain, illuminate, and surprise. They discover patterns, they forge analogies, and they undermine conventional wisdom. They force us to rethink what we thought we knew. I don't think it would be difficult to find parallels in the natural sciences. Think, for example, of the enormous importance of Drosophila and other model organisms for the modern science of genetics, or the role of the Gaussian curve as a model first for observational error in astronomy, then of human traits like height and intelligence, and finally of the distribution of molecular velocities in an ideal gas. A specific case becomes an engine of explanation and generalization by means of perceptive analogies. But there is at least one critical difference between the exempla of the human sciences and the models of the natural sciences, and it is not the difference between the qualitative and the quantitative. One can find examples of both sorts of reasoning in studies of nature and studies of humans. Rather, it lies in the preconditions for generalization. And let me just give you 3 examples in ascending order of complexity. So first is a simple induction. How many people in this room have blood type O? And the second is a generalization from a model species, let's say Drosophila, fruit flies, to squirrels. And the third is a class of phenomena encircled by an exemplum. So in the first case, which is the normal case in much of the natural sciences, the category of things to be counted must be predefined and its members sufficiently homogeneous in order to be counted. This is what statisticians call a reference class. In the second case, fruit flies and squirrels are most assuredly different species, but we do know in advance that they are species. But in the third case, we do not even know that there is an interesting, coherent category until the exemplum makes it light up like neon. That bland word interesting ought itself to be lit up in neon. An exemplum doesn't just define a class of phenomena. That would be the equivalent of a naturalist cataloging a new species of insect or plant. An exemplum worthy of its name highlights a class that turns out to be the key that unlocks many other puzzles, previously thought to be quite unrelated. Goffman's example of royal decorum explains why awe and shame go hand in hand. Baxandall's exemplum of that bizarre hat explains why so many Renaissance paintings feature geometrical teasers. Fisher's exemplum of the raging baby explains the deep connection between anger and the will. Doniger's exemplum explains why knowing and feeling could not and should not always be distinguished. This is where epistemology intersects with ontology, where how we know and what we know converge. Exempla remake the world at the same time that they reveal it. Thank you very much.